We're going to go through basically three core components. I'll give an introduction to our project and what we have done around teaching and assessing critical thinking skills. And then the three elements are define, assess, and teach. And this is really coming from that understanding by design work. And that is that it is thinking about what is the outcome that we want for students, designing assessments that will give us information about how students are performing on that. And then only after doing that do we decide what we're going to actually do with kids. And so thinking about the teaching component, but backwards design and thinking about what is the outcome and the end result that we want for students, and then building our skills around assessing that and teaching it to realize that for all kids. And then we'll finish up with a synthesis and an open period for questions. At Two Rivers, we have a mission that is about realizing broader outcomes for all students. And that includes the core content and basic skills that we have traditionally taught in schools, like reading, writing, math. But it's also about their social emotional learning, so collaboration and communication and character. And then what we're talking about today, the critical thinking and problem solving skills. First, within the classroom assessment and standardized assessments to address core content and basic skills. And those are the traditional assessments we've given. I'm not going to speak about this too much today, but under collaboration and communication, those social emotional skills, we have a set of all habits that help define what those social emotional learning skills are for our students. Our kids produce portfolios and do student-led conferences, and they reflect on their development of their social emotional skills. And then the last piece that I'll mention is around critical thinking problem solving, where we're going to focus today. And that is that we're in an EL education school in the United States, which means we do project-based learning. And so our kids produce projects, and very often those projects involve critical thinking and problem solving skills. And then we have a set of performance assessments that we've now developed to look at whether or not those students are able to transfer the skills that they learned in the projects that they produced. So we've broken up critical thinking and problem solving into three core competencies or constructs, and those are effective reasoning, problem solving, and decision making. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward, but just in general, the way we think about effective reasoning is about making evidence-based claims and helping our students identify claims, identify the best evidence, and then supporting their claims with that evidence. For problem solving, it is basically what it says, but thinking through problems, what do you bring to the problem, and then how are you metacognitive around your process as you move through a problem. And then last but not least is decision making. We found that it was really helpful for our students to slow down and identify some core components in their decision making, from what are their choices, what is the criteria that helps them to evaluate those choices, and then as they evaluate, comparing their choices using the criteria, and then making a final choice and recognizing what the consequences of those choices might be. And all of this is predicated on this idea that we've defined those outcomes, but that has to be then aligned with our assessment, and then our assessment is aligned with our instruction. So that's really at the core of what we're looking at doing. And as we think about assessment, we think about it slightly differently, because it's really about using assessment to drive instruction. But this gives you a sense. These are our effective reasoning rubrics, and they are on a continuum from preschool through 8th grade. And then we assess through performance assessment. All of these performance assessments are intended to be content neutral, so not specific to our English classes or math classes or science or social studies or foreign language. These assessments are intended to get at just the thinking skills, and so we try to lower the bar on some of the other components, and get at how are kids actually problem solving or reasoning through a problem, and to what degree are they able to apply that to a novel or new situation. And then last but not least, we teach towards these skills using what Ron Richard calls thinking routines.
After we figured out our choices, the next step is to figure out what criteria we're going to use to make our choice.
We have to assess what matters. And if we believe that critical thinking matters, we have to measure whether or not we're doing it well.
We talk about assessment in two ways. One is assessment of learning, and then really what we call assessment for learning.
Assessment of learning is summative. It happens at the end of a unit. Assessment for learning is formative. It happens during a unit and directly informs instruction.
So when you're looking at a period of learning has happened and you assess it, you want to know, did my students get what I focused on and taught?
But if I can gather some information as learning is happening, and then use that to give feedback to me, the instructor, as well as the student, then we can improve the learning outcome in the end. And assessment for learning is a powerful tool for doing that.
When teaching complex thinking types, teachers must evaluate each student's progress and make adjustments.
We've built assessments that you can use to assess how well students are doing this thinking along a continuum.
And they're just tasks that are open-ended that allow me to really see their thinking and evaluate what part is missing from that component.
It checks me to make sure that I'm not making assumptions about students.
Yeah, and I think that what happens to me sometimes is that I mix it up, and sometimes I start comparing and contrasting before I think of criteria. Does that happen to you too?
Kind of my stopping point to really focus on the work and what it's telling me.
And think about, what is it that you taught? How did you teach it? And think about, did it work? Did it not work?
We have seen some really surprising information and data that comes out of doing these assessments. Certain kids who are typically sort of the higher academically performing kids struggle with like elements of decision making, and a kid who might not be the most articulate demonstrates some insights into like how to identify criteria and evaluate the choices that I've made.
And what does that mean, looping and skipping?
And I think that that is really what is powerful in the learning enterprise, is to use assessment as a tool to help close the gap between where we are currently and where we want students to be in the future. So based on this, like, what do you feel like the next instructional move would be based on the data that we're seeing here?
So I think one of the things that
You need to know where the kids are and where you're going, and it's never done.
Kids aren't just like this linear set of data, but they're dynamic and messy. Assessment for learning, it really helps all kids and it raises all boats.
We'll start with the rubric component, and for the example around define and assess, we're going to focus just primarily on the problem-solving component, but all of those assessment components and rubrics are available on our website at learnwith2rivers.org. But just looking at this rubric, I want to highlight a couple of things. First, all of our rubrics do move from a beginning stage all the way to an exemplary stage for and give a continuum of growth. The other piece is along the left-hand side, you'll see components. We break up each construct into a set of clearly defined components, and what that helps us do is help us identify what are the very specific skills that a student needs to, in this example, problem solving well. And by breaking up problem solving into some discrete elements or and moves that a student can make as they are problem solving, we are able to pinpoint what is it that a kid is doing well and how to improve their thinking processes so that they become more effective or more efficient in their process. And then the one other piece that I'll mention is that for our students, we typically look towards accomplished as being the place we want kids to go, but then we want to push them towards the exemplary in the long run. The last thing that I will mention about the rubric is that it is a great place for us to then start to use the language of where a student is to help give them feedback to improve. And so key ideas there are that rubrics define the construct that we want to teach and assess for students and teachers. Each component on the rubric needs to be mutually exclusive. So that means that if I look at a component, it can't be that a student can perform really well on that and then they automatically perform really well on another component. So they, while they are deeply interrelated to each other, we try to tease out what are discrete skills within the problem solving or reasoning skills that we want kids to develop. And then the last piece that I mentioned before is that the rubrics define a continuum of growth. Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that we do end up giving kids the rubrics themselves, and I'll share a more student-friendly rubric that we use with our younger kids near the end when we talk about teaching. And so you can have actual kids assessing themselves or each other on their process. But one of the things that I feel like is really powerful is taking a set of student work in which kids have made their thinking visible. And we'll look at an example of that in a minute. But then rating them on a rubric and then giving them the rubric back the following day, in which you can share, like, this is where I saw your strength and here's an area for growth for you on the rubric. All right, so we're going to dive right now into the assessment piece, and the assessment piece is really built off of those rubrics. And I'm going to give you guys an example of a problem-solving assessment that we give to students. And when we dive into this, I say to students right off the bat that the goal for this assessment is not for you to just solve this problem. I mean, it's great to solve the problem, but my goal for kids is that they make their thinking visible and show their problem-solving process. And by framing the activity that we're going to do as making their thinking visible, it realigns their thinking so that it's not just about figuring out how to create a bridge in this case, but it is really about how to put their thinking on paper and share that with their teacher. And ultimately, this is certainly within the context of a bridge making activity, but we talk about it having implications across the curriculum. And so if they're in a math class, how are they making their thinking visible as they solve problems? If they're in science, how are they making their thinking visible or similarly within any of their other classes? And so here's the example. So the problem is, with a set of given materials, create the longest bridge span that you possibly can between two cups. And so the idea there is just to create a bridge that holds up between two cups, and you want to make the longest one possible. And so what we do is we give kids 4 rubber bands, 2 sheets of 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper, 12 inches of tape, and 2 red cups. And so that's all they get. But remember, there's intended to create the longest bridge span between those 2 cups. Then there's a set of rules. The bridge must stand independently between the 2 cups. You do not have to use all of the materials, but they're only allowed to use the materials that they have. And then the last thing is they can cut up any piece of the material so that it doesn't have to stay as is. But once again, they can only use those paper, the rubber band, the tape, and the cups. And then here's really the crux of the task is we break up, it's like a single class period. It can be done within an hour. And in that assessment, individual kids have the opportunity to start to plan. And I'm going to show you some student work in a second so you can get a sense of what this looks like, but that's where they make their thinking visible. When I do this with students, I usually pair them up into pairs, and with those pairs, they then have some group planning time to build the bridge, and then they have 7.5 minutes of work time to actually build the bridge, and then they stop though, and we do what I call a metacognitive moment. I have them come back and do some individual reflection. And it's often hard for kids to stop in the middle of a process, but I feel like it's important because it is about teaching those kids the critical thinking skills, but using this assessment as a good example of that. They're asked to reflect on where they are in the process of designing their bridge and what are they doing effectively, what do they might need to change. And then they move on to a second work session where they're building their bridge again. And then we finish with having them measure their results. But then the key thing again is that they have a last opportunity to reflect and make their thinking visible again. And so that individual planning at the top, the individual reflection in the middle, and the individual reflection at the end is really the core of the assessment, because that is where kids are going to be creating evidence of how they are thinking through a problem and what they're doing effectively in their problem solving. Once kids have done that task, we think about how do you score and look at that with the rubric. And so we use a rubric next to the student work and assess kids on each of those components. Some key points around assessing kids' work is first trusting the data in front of them, sticking with the language of the rubric. So we really, one of the big pieces of data that I have found in working with teachers is that we often want to make assumptions about how kids are thinking, and I really encourage them to not do that, but to look at the actual language of the rubric. And then the last piece is only using whole number scores. And why I do that is that if the difference is between, we'll say like a 2 and a 3 on the rubric, so that's between emerging and accomplished. I encourage teachers to say, okay, you have a 2 or an emerging and not an accomplished. And the reason that you want to do that is that you can then identify what is the very specific language within the rubric that the student is not demonstrating, so that they then can learn from that and use that in their future work. By sort of parsing and saying, oh, we're going to give them a 2.5, they're in between emerging and accomplished. We don't necessarily just say, okay, so where in the rubric, and let's go back to the actual language of the rubric about where they are. And so if they haven't actually achieved everything in the 3 component, we want to identify what is it that they need to do to move towards that accomplished component. All right, now we're going to take a look at a set of student work. And as we are doing that, we're going to review the pieces. And what I want you to think about as you do that is, how did the questions we ask students tie back to the rubrics that we use? This is hopefully a key point throughout this webinar, is that you need assessment to line up with the questions that you ask kids to do, so the activities that you want. And so like if you want to get a particular set of evidence related to a rubric, you need to ask questions that are going to drive towards that. And then the last piece is that as we are thinking about how do we have students make their thinking visible, and I want you to consider how we are able to do that throughout. All right, so we're going to jump into, this is an actual student's work. This is how they see the problem. It was the problem that I just shared with you a minute ago on the previous slides. And we start with that initial planning phase. And during that, the student has looked through the problem and identified what she knows, what she needs to be able to figure out. So this is what we call a KWI. So what do I know? What do I need to find out? And then last, what are my ideas for solutions? So I'm going to give you a second to take a look at what she's done there. All right. And then she also had a continued place to think about within her KWI. So what do I know? What do I need to find out? What are my ideas? To continue to make her thinking visible. And I want to highlight a piece here, and that is that she's drawn some pictures down at the bottom to get some ideas for how she's going to build her bridge. And what I want to highlight about that is that in making thinking visible, we often lean towards language, and language is really, really important as we think about thinking skills, because often the substance of our thinking is in our language. And so how do we convey those ideas both internally and then externally? But also letting kids find ways of making their thinking visible beyond just the written word is important. And so having opportunities for them to draw pictures is really powerful. There were some questions earlier prior to the webinar about how do we help kids with special needs, and I think that this is a good point here. So letting them draw is a great opportunity. The other important piece that I think is valuable is to give kids the opportunity to dictate, to either an audio record their responses, or dictate to somebody that can write their responses down, is also another powerful way to make their thinking visible. If the goal is about thinking, it's not about the handwriting or the physical writing of the material, right? So you want to be able to capture that material in whatever way possible. So moving on, the second point where we have students reflect is after their first work session. And this is where the student again has taken a look at what she has done. And you'll notice she's included both words and pictures in thinking about what worked and what didn't work and what she might do again. This is that metacognitive moment. And then we moved on to, at the very end, the final reflection. And that final reflection has included both an opportunity for her to draw pictures and to consider what she has done effectively. And then last but not least, has given her the opportunity to reflect on what would she do differently if she were going to do this problem again. And so to really evaluate her work and evaluate what she has done effectively. I want to just highlight a couple of key things that we have found in developing assessments like this. These kinds of short performance assessments is one is giving teachers multiple opportunities to score the work collectively. What I have found is even if it's just getting a colleague to look at some student work with you, it is so valuable to have that peer-to-peer relationship and thinking about what is effective in this rubric, what's not effective, and what's happening with that student work. And it's a good check against our own biases as we look at our student work. Second is allowing teachers an opportunity to unpack the places where there's inconsistency in scoring. And so thinking about, oh, well, I gave the student an accomplished and you gave it an exemplary. Let's talk about what's the difference between where you thought it was and where I thought it was, and like what is the evidence that you're drawing upon. And I feel like that those kinds of conversations are really powerful within schools and within learning environments. Next is do move towards providing an authoritative final score with a rationale for the score. The more you do use rubrics like this, the better you will be at it, but also creating some definitive exemplar pieces of work with definitive scoring helps you to have
Jeff Heyck-Williams.
Yeah, for the assessments themselves, we standardize that, so that is decided by the assessors. one of the big key points that we have found at our school is to define instructional tasks versus assessment tasks. An assessment task, we try to be a little more standardized so that we can look across classes, and then also so like if I'm teaching the same assessment task to multiple groups of students over the course of a day or a week, I can look at that assessment data as a common assessment for all of those students, so they all had the same experience. So one of the key things, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but we use the same sets of questions over and over and over again. They're thinking routines, and we have kids give answers to those questions within the example of these tasks, but then we also have it within the regular everyday opportunities of instruction. And so this sheet here, this is our KWI. What do you know about the problem? What do you need to find out? And what are your ideas for solutions or how to solve the problem? We use that as a regular point of starting kids on problems. And then similarly, we use these other questions like what worked or didn't work, what will you try next, as regular reflection questions. And then the one last piece that I find really, really powerful is asking kids what makes you say that. And that is that when kids are explaining an answer, particularly if they're doing it verbally, but also, but you can do it as well as in writing too. And that is, if they give an explanation, just follow it up with what makes you say that. It is a simple question that that actually pushes kids to provide more rationale or reasoning for their thinking. Yeah, so we have a very diverse group of students at our school, from wide ranges of socioeconomic status, a large number of different races of students. And then we have a very high number of special needs students. So around 20% of our students are special needs. And what I would say is that all of them, we find ways that all of them can access these same problems, and mostly it is through the same problem. The one key thing that I would say is that we keep in mind what is the goal of the assessment tool, and making sure that that is consistent, but applying whatever accommodations to help kids access that goal without taking the thinking off the table for them. So if it is about making the thinking visible, we do want to like maybe take away the reading component so that they don't have to actually read the text. So we'll read it aloud to them or have it read aloud to them. And then similarly, if writing is an issue, we give them other opportunities to dictate their answers, as opposed to having them actually process and write the work themselves, but actually give it to us verbally. So I think one of the big things is just being adaptable around the task is important, but then also keeping in mind and not letting the core elements of the assessment change from assessment to assessment. And that really is building off of that work of Ron Richard, Project Zero, and his book, Making Thinking Visible, and some of those thinking routines. And then you can obviously see on our website, Learn with Two Rivers, those thinking routines. So we have basically 3 thinking types that are associated with each of our thinking types or constructs of critical thinking, and those are problem solving, effective reasoning, and decision making. And what you see right here are examples of the anchor charts that we use in classrooms to teach kids about those thinking types. And and I'll go over them really quickly. I talked about in problem solving, it was KWI, so what do you know, what do you need to find out, what are your ideas for solutions? For effective reasoning, it's really about it making evidence-based claims. And this one came straight from Project Zero, but it is, how do you make claims? How do you support those claims? And then how do you question those claims, which is really moving kids to critique their own claims, but then move ultimately to what is a counterclaim and how would I address that within my own claim. And then the last portion is decision making, which I talked a little bit about before and is up front. It was around making choices, identifying criteria, and then also prioritizing that criteria, comparing the criteria or the choices based on the criteria, and then making a final choice. The last thing that I'll say about these thinking routines before I get into some specifics with examples is that that they have to be truly routines, which means they have to be done over and over and over again. You could grab and use any one of these once with a group of students, and then it would just be an activity. And it's not bad. It's a great way of structuring an activity for kids, but it's not going to lead to them developing a habit of thinking that is effective. So they have to see it over and over again in multiple contexts and opportunities for it actually to start to transfer for kids and become useful. And then the one last piece related to that is if you're doing it over and over again, using the rubrics to give kids feedback on it helps them to develop those skills more effectively. With our classes, and in those examples, I'll give one around decision making in our middle school with our 7th graders, and then with our 2nd graders, though, I'll talk about how we used effective reasoning, so the making effective claims. So as you can see, the teacher created an anchor chart to introduce the idea for kids. So this was up in the classroom and kids could see it. So using sources available to make a claim, they defined support as using evidence to back up their claim. And then the question portion, what would someone else say to challenge your claim? And really, how are they starting to respond by saying, but they would be wrong because. And so 2nd graders have gotten real creative with this. And in some cases, they're going home to their parents to making a claim as to why they should have dessert tonight. But let me give you a couple of other key pieces. One is this. This is our effective reasoning rubric that we use with our elementary grade kids. So this is an example of the same kind of rubric that you'll find on our website, but this is one that we give directly to kids and have them both self-assess as well as having the teacher give feedback based on this. And then we've used a couple of different short examples in the class to teach the routine. One is doing the game Would You Rather, and here's an example of that where we ask the kids, would you rather be the leader of a country on Earth or start a new colony on a different planet? And in this case, they have to make a claim, and then they have to identify some support. The support more likely in these kinds of games are going to come from their own experience and their own preferences. But the real key is just getting the idea that this is how we reason effectively, is we don't just make statements without having some sort of support. Another example that we use, particularly in our younger grades, and so like kindergarten, preschool classes, is what is this picture? We give a small example, or a small component of a picture. And as you can see, there's not a lot of information. It looks like there's a tire and some legs. It is and then eventually we reveal it, but we only reveal it after kids have made a claim and supported it based on what they saw in that original picture. And so giving them, once again, just another opportunity to practice how do I make an effective claim and support it. And in this case, they can also make counterclaims, like what would somebody else might think it is. And that's really hard, particularly for those younger kids, but giving them opportunities to think, somebody might think that that's something different than what your original thought was. And then the last piece with our 2nd graders is that we have applied this work to class and in our projects. And so our 2nd graders did a review of our eco policies at our school and thinking about what would be a good way to improve the environmental impact at our school. And so as you can see, based on our survey data, 20% of the community brought water bottles all the time. And so a student made a claim about using water bottles, reusable water bottles at the school. And so this was an example. This is actual student writing that a second grader created, and it really came from a set of evidence that she identified from our real community. This is an anchor chart that the 7th grade teacher used with her kids just to define what are the components of effective decision making. And she started off the year with class jobs, and she had all of the students identify what would the criteria be for a strong application, and then what were the criteria for each of the jobs. And you can kind of see some of the example jobs there, things like attendance clerk, so somebody that takes attendance in the morning, or the horticulturist who takes care of the plants in the classroom. So the kids identified what would the criteria be. They evaluated choices around what they would personally like to apply for, and then they made some decisions about what an effective application might look like as they apply. And which job they personally would like the best. And then in examples, they've applied this to some specific content. And the example that I have here is they were studying the United States Civil War, and after the Civil War, students were looking at the Southern side that lost, the Confederate leaders, what would happen to those leaders, and what should happen to the land, and what should politicians do in relation to that. And so they had a bunch of different questions that they identified, and as they identified those questions, they thought about what would an effective decision be for those political leaders in the North and in the United States as we were trying to reknit our country back together after our Civil War. So that's just an example of how they use the decision-making routine. And you can't really see all of these necessarily, but this is where kids actually use an anchor chart or note catchers, which identify what are your choices, what are your criteria, how do you compare your choices, and then how do you choose in the end. And this is where they could actually apply it directly to examples like the Civil War example or other examples within the class. But in wrapping up, I just want to emphasize again that the core idea is that we identify what we want for kids, and only through identifying those things that we want for kids are we going to be able to design assessments and instruction that are going to drive towards those outcomes. But ultimately then, if we align assessment to those outcomes, and those outcomes are good, then we should teach to the test. And I feel like that's a big phrase here in the US and we don't like teaching to the test. And I think we don't like teaching to the test because often the test doesn't really define the things that we care about. If we want kids to be effective critical thinkers though, and we define and create assessments that do that, I don't think that teaching to the test is a bad thing because if the test is actually defining what we want kids to be able to do, then we're assessing that. That's great. And then the last piece is that assessment really should be speaking to instruction. And we, as in that video, we separate assessment of learning, which is what a lot of standardized assessments do versus and like end of term assessments. But thinking about what is assessment for learning. And how do you use assessment data to give you powerful information that informs your instruction and improves the outcomes for kids? So thinking about like, what is the very specific thing that a kid needs to get better at, and how do I give them feedback so that they can improve on that thing? So I'm going to finish up with just a request to follow us. We're on Twitter at Two Rivers PCS, and I'm on Twitter at Heyck-Williams. We're also on the web at thatlearnwithtworivers.org, so please check that out if you have time. This work has been funded by the Assessment for Learning Project, and there's lots of other great projects that happened here in the United States around the Assessment for Learning work. And then Firki and Teach for India found us through the 100.org, and so there's 100 global innovations in education that you can check out there, and so there's lots of really great resources at that spot as well. So our rubrics were developed over an iterative process by teachers, teacher teams, and then me as an administrator. But we did an exhaustive set of research through a number of the frameworks for critical thinking, and looking at how are people defining those constructs, and what are other rubrics out there. And so you'll note at the bottoms of all of our rubrics, we cite a source there. The one other piece that we did was we worked with the Stanford Center on Assessment, Learning, and Equity on creating some validity in our rubrics over time. And so they gave us feedback and helped us make some revisions to our rubrics to get them to the final place where they are. Those rubrics then are formalized, and then we of course have then created some student-friendly rubrics, and those are not standardized across classes, but are given to students within the classrooms, and in some cases our teachers share a lot with each other, and so they are being used across multiple classrooms. And so I think I shared this example before here, and so that is used in a lot of our classrooms now, but that's not one of the ones that was formally vetted across our classrooms. So here's the first thing that I would say is that we design these rubrics defining what we want for all students, period. Like, what will we define as really effective critical thinking skills? And so we're not thinking about where a student is coming to us from and what skill set they're bringing to us, and what ability or in some cases a disability that they might have. We really define it as what do we want to achieve for every kid. And I think that that's really important for us, because if we don't define an aspirational goals for our kids, then it's hard to actually to realize that. So I'll start there. But then as we think about students who may have a disability or a challenge, we then think about, like, what are the ways or scaffolds that we can give to a kid so that they can realize or achieve those goals that are defined within the rubric. And so taking them from where they are and maybe breaking down individual components. And so, for example, I have this effective reasoning rubric up right now, and if we have a student who can't write, that's not necessarily a hindrance to them actually making a claim and supporting it, particularly if it's around like what is this picture, but having them do it verbally and doing it with a peer, having them give each other feedback around that, and then really looking at the rubric and, like, how did I make a basic claim around my understanding of what I saw, or was I making a claim but I didn't fully understand what was going on? And how would I help them say, okay, what's going on in that situation, and how could I help them make a more effective claim in the future? In the case of our effective reasoning rubric, we do have separate rubrics for preschool, pre-K, so that's our 3 and 4 year olds, and then K1, and then and then we have it by grade band, so 2, 3, second grade and third grade, fourth and fifth grade, and then our middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade altogether. What we found was with that, we were looking at a continuum of growth that we saw in kids' ability to make effective claims and support them. With our problem-solving rubric, we have been using that for over 10 years now, and our early childhood teachers, while they don't give the rubric in the way that it is to kids directly, they found that it was really useful in assessing the early childhood kids, just like it was for our older kids. And so it defined we didn't have sort of developmentally different rubrics there. And then for the decision making, we have one that is for younger grades, and then one that is, and the younger grades is like preschool through first grade, so up to like 6 and 7 year olds. And then we have a separate one that we use for our older kids. Yeah, really, I mean, the biggest thing that I can emphasize is just what I talked about is doing thinking routines with them, have a regular opportunity to develop those skills. And so let me give you just one quick example around problem solving that we do with kids, which is having them every single time that they have a problem, whether it's a social problem or an academic problem, having them do the KWI. And so, so for example, if kids like are got into a fight at recess, we talk about like, what do you know about this problem? What do you need to find out? And what are your ideas for solutions or ways to address that problem? So the assessment piece is done in isolation. That is totally separate, and it really is with the intent of getting information about whether or not kids are able to transfer the skill that they were taught within their context of their classroom to other subjects or into other contexts. So that is in isolation. However, we teach critical thinking and problem solving skills within the context of our classes, and then we use them regularly. So we use that KWI routine all the time for problem solving. And I mean, particularly in math class, but we use it in science, we use it in our English classes, we use it all the time. And the big point is that if you don't use it all the time, it's not a routine, it's really just an activity. And so anytime kids are seeing problems, they're giving those opportunities over and over and over again to develop the skill. Yeah, you know what? So this rubric is really just to assess critical thinking and problem solving skills. And of course, that's not all that we care about. And so we have to have other kinds of assessment tools to assess those things. And just to give some context, we only give these kinds of the performance assessment that I shared with you once or twice a year with kids, and it's really as a proof point to see whether or not they're transferring those skills. But we also have to give other kinds of assessments to kids where and really assessments that are embedded in the content and context of the class. But that said, that doesn't mean you can't use a thinking routine on those kinds of assessments either. So like if you're giving a math test and you're asking kids to problem solve, they can use their KWI to help them problem solve. Or if you're giving them an essay question on some other kind of content class, you have them write a CSQ where they make a claim and support it in response to whatever the essay question or prompt is. It's like in terms of defining or just designing the assessment task itself, it was through an iterative process, but one of the big things that we found was that students needed the opportunity to be reflective before they problem solve and unpack a problem. They needed some time to actually problem solve and work on the problem. but to be metacognitive midway through and then to reflect at the end. And when we first started, we didn't have that reflective piece in the middle, and we found that it was really important to their problem solving. It's not that in actual problem solving outside of school, when they leave us, we expect them to stop and be metacognitive all the time when they're problem solving, but to build the muscle of what does it look like and feel like, to pause and consider where are we in our process, because ultimately we want it to be a habit of mind that kids can use all of the time. And so we built that in from seeing how kids were learning and how kids were applying these skills. I think it just varies. It varies on the kid, and it varies on what the skill set is that you're looking at. The other thing is, I mentioned in the video, I don't think kids are a linear set of data, and I don't necessarily think that they develop on these rubrics in a completely linear fashion. What I would prefer to say is that when a student takes an assessment, any assessment, I'd like to think of it as like, I use a metaphor of taking a photograph. Sometimes when you take a photograph, it's in focus, and sometimes it's not, or sometimes it gets your good side, and sometimes it doesn't. It gets your bad side or whatever. And that doesn't mean that the out of focus or the bad side photograph is not an inaccurate photograph. It's still an accurate photograph. It's just what you looked like at that moment with that camera at that place, right? Similarly, assessments do the same thing, and using the rubrics do the same thing. It tells us this is where you were at this moment, and then how do I help you more consistently demonstrate an accomplished level of critical thinking and problem solving skills over time. And so giving you multiple opportunities to do that and giving lots of feedback is really, really key to it. And so I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like, oh, there's this like bound time frame, but it is about integrating a regular practice of critical thinking skills, and then using assessment tools to give us some information about where kids are and helping them push forward and get better at the skill. I think that there are lots of different ways that you can do that. I mean, if you're in a really large class, you can literally like underline components of the rubric where they are, and have some sort of either underline or circle where they are. So like you were able to accomplish this. And I mean, the more information that you can give, the better. So if you can give like specific evidence or specific places on their work where they are demonstrating elements of the rubric, that's great. And then giving that back to them so they know specifically where they were and what they were able to do. The other big thing that I think is really, really key is to identify what is their goal for the next time. So what is the small next step that's going to move them further on the rubric over time. And so identifying a specific piece of language to say, next time I want to see you try this piece. Yeah, so we've tried to create anchor pieces for each of the assessments, and so that we can use those consistently. Those are just example student pieces. We don't have those available publicly because, well, just because of sharing student work. It's a skill that I think is really important to build in students. With that said, it is a skill that has to be taught to them. And so our school does a lot to help kids learn how to self-assess. And so giving them those rubrics and then having them reflect on them. And then in conjunction with that, having see their teacher score, and then being able to compare where was I in my own self-reflection versus where the teacher was, and We don't expect teachers and students to be in alignment 100% of the time. We often see that over time, students score themselves more harshly than their teachers do. But that's not always the case, of course. But over time, that's what we typically end up seeing kids do, and that's partially just because they need regular opportunities to see the rubric, assess themselves on it, and then also have the teacher do the same thing, and then compare. Yeah, I think that similar to some of the things that I shared before can be used with young adults. I think just thinking about their context. So like young adults have to make decisions all the time, and so we often we start with our decision-making routine with older folks, and asking them, like, when you make a decision, what's the criteria that you use to make that decision? How do you prioritize that criteria? Having them then think about, okay, so now how do you compare those choices using that criteria? So you're just using the routine, but using it within the context of the decisions that they might be making. Whether that is, oh, you're thinking about applying for a job. Which jobs are you choosing from, and how do you make an effective choice around which jobs you apply for? But then the point there, though, is that these routines are really content neutral and are intended to be used across grade bands and age levels. And so we can do the same thing with a small kid around, how do you choose what clothes you're going to wear this morning? We do share the rubrics with parents. I have some teachers that are doing that more readily than others, but we do something called student-led conference. And if you take a look at the Learn with Two Rivers website, you can see some information about student-led conferences. But I think the most powerful way to share this with parents is to have the kids share it, and they can talk about, so we've been doing this routine regularly in our class around problem solving, and here's how I'm doing with it. Like and talking through an example of a problem that they solved, maybe within very specific context. Here's a math problem I solved. Here's how I identified what I know about that problem. Here's how what I needed to find out, and here are my ideas for starting it. And then this is my actual work and what I did to solve that problem. And this is how I evaluated that process. And next time I'm going to do something similar, but this is an area that I'm going to improve. Like, I'm going to start to draw on my previous experience, my background knowledge around fractions next time I do this kind of problem. But having kids actually share that work at those student-led conferences, I think, is one of the most powerful ways to share that with families. But even then, like, if you're doing a more traditional kind of conference or talking to families, just talking through, like, giving an example of work, and maybe work that's specific to the context and not necessarily just the assessments. Yeah, I think that the most powerful way to motivate kids, not just about critical thinking, but certainly it applies to critical thinking as well, is to give kids context for their learning that is meaningful to them, so that they see a powerful reason to be learning this content, and have a real audience for sharing it. I mentioned student-led conference. That's a powerful real-world audience for our kids, because they know that they're going to be presenting to their families. But then the other example, we do a lot of project-based learning, and so giving them real-world context. So our 8th graders do a public space project where they talk about how to redesign public space to be more democratic. And then they present to local business district leaders about that. But they're using the effective reasoning routine. They're making a claim and supporting it in their presentation. And so by doing examples of that kind of work, they have a real context for learning it, and they care about it because it's about their personal space, about their own community, and it gives a lot of motivation for kids to learn the skill so that they're more effective and they're talking to real people with real power that that is giving them access to those critical thinking skills. I think, so I was just talking about our effective reasoning routine, and I think that that's a great one that we align with our literacy instruction all of the time, and that is that students regularly need to make claims and support those, whether that's like, oh, so I read this piece of literature and I want to make a claim about what the theme of the novel was, or if they're reading across nonfiction texts, how do they make a claim about the ideas that are being portrayed in those, and drawing the evidence directly from that text to support those claims. And I feel like that is at the heart of being a strong reader, is to be able to not just make a claim, but actually support it and connect the support. But then also to think about what are the counterclaims and how do I address people that might think differently or read the same thing and have a different interpretation. I don't have a ton of like hard data around that, but I would just say that we see a couple of things in our kids when they move on to high school, and then we have a few students who have moved on to college in our 16 years, and that is that we see kids that are better able to persevere through problems, who are able to make effective claims, and are thinking more critically about the decisions they make. And one example is we have a teacher who is also a parent at our school, and when her daughter was thinking about college, she actually used the decision-making routine to think about which colleges she was both going to apply to, and then ultimately, once she got her acceptance, she used the decision-making thinking routine to help her think through, like, how do I decide which college I'm actually going to end up attending?